Welcome to They Live by Film, a platform dedicated to bringing you film discussion and interviews from around the world. I'm Adam Lundy, and I'm this week not joined by my co hosts. This is going to be a solo podcast episode. And in today's episode, we're going to be bringing back a format that we played around with last year while I was having a bit of downtime. That was really popular, probably a bit more popular than we expected. We were really just doing it to tie over, in between recording proper episodes. And I'm going to bring it back today, and it's essentially going to be a sort of director ranking or a director tier list. I played around with this a little bit on our YouTube channel. If you obviously haven't checked out that, the link will be in the description. But I've been kind of revisiting a filmmaker that I haven't watched really in a long, long time. And it's one that I've kind of brought up a few times, this year, maybe sometimes last year. And it's Quentin Tarantino. Usually, when I bring him up in episodes, it's in a negative light, maybe a bit more negative than I should be. So I was kind of thinking a few weeks ago that I've been talking about him and his films a lot, but apart from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I actually haven't seen any of his films in about 10 years. So over the last couple of weeks, I've essentially rewatched all of his movies. So I've watched everything up as far again as what rewatching Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And I'm just going to give my ranking and my thoughts on his filmography. This was really good for me to kind of recontextualize a director that I just haven't seen in a long time. Maybe I had a few negative things to say about him in the past, and a lot of that has been quelled. A lot of it has been backed up by what I've seen. So I'm just going to put my thoughts out here in a recording format, and hopefully you guys will enjoy. So starting off with what's kind of last in my rankings is probably an uncontroversial pick, just from what I know and sort of talk to people about films. Usually, generally place this film kind of towards the end as well. It's 2007's Death Proof, which was part of the sort of grindhouse double feature that Tarantino did with Robert Rodriguez. Features Kurt Russell as a homicidal stuntman, has a pretty decent supporting cast. Zoe Bell playing herself, Rosario Dawson, Mary Elizabeth Winstead, Rose McGowan has a part in it as well. It's a film that it's interesting on paper, but I find that it's just not executed all that well. When you watch it, as part of this sort of, I don't want to say gimmick, but it is kind of gimmicky. As part of this sort of fake grindhouse exploitation style film, there's a lot of superficial things that he does, like has like the film grains, all sort of tear up at some points. There's parts where the film literally like stutters as people are saying a line. It's made sort of superficially to look cheaper than it actually is, which, some people really liked that. They thought it was cool that he was referencing this stuff. But for me, it just didn't sit for me. It wasn't my cup of tea. I totally get where he's coming from, with wanting to try to recreate that feel, that very certain aesthetic of this low budget exploitation grindhouse style movie. It just didn't work for me. I didn't find that appealing, which I know is more of a personal problem. But it's my ranking, so everything's going to be a personal problem when I have one. I do find the concept itself interesting. I was reading up about it, and essentially Tarantino's idea for this film was that he wanted to make a slasher film, but felt that the slasher genre is very constrictive in terms of the tropes and things that you can and can't do, which is understandable. And for someone like him who likes to, try and push the envelope a little bit, it made sense for him to not want to be pigeonholed into a certain genre. So he had this idea to make a slasher film, but under the guise of an exploitation movie. And that's where you do get an interesting concept out of this movie. The fact that we have a stuntman who has basically built a car that is death proof for him, picks up people and basically murders them with his car, by doing like basically crashing in the sort of craziest, most lethal way possible. Very, very interesting concept. But for me, just didn't come together in terms of the execution. It's directed pretty okay, but Tarantino actually shot this film. He was a cinematographer on it, which I'm pretty sure, looking at just off the top of my head, pretty sure it's the only time he was ever the director of the director of sort of photography for one of his movies or maybe any movie. And I think the fact that it looks not great maybe is because of that. Maybe if he had a an actual qualified cinematographer, an experienced cinematographer alongside him, it might not look like that. It might have looked a little bit different, and maybe that could have helped. But yeah, for me, bottom of the pile, by a pretty decent way, is Death Proof. So next up in terms of my rankings is Quentin Tarantino's second most recent movie at the time of recording, which was 2015's The Hateful Eight, which sees a group of bounty hunters in the kind of old west, held up in a like a B&B, a cabin essentially, and a mystery begins to unfold during a really heavy blizzard. Um, this is again another film, kind of like Death Proof, that has a really interesting concept. It has a good story, and it definitely, as the film goes on, it becomes a really great mystery film. I kind of joked about this in my Letterboxd review that the mystery is almost like a sort of proto Knives Out story. I'd be surprised if Ryan Johnson wasn't maybe a little bit inspired by The Hateful Eight, and just in terms of balancing the violence, the comedy, and the mystery. Um, if he didn't take some of that from The Hateful Eight, because it certainly has those elements. But the main problem for me with The Hateful Eight, and becomes a sort of common trend throughout this, is just down to the length. Really, it's a very long film. It clocks in just over 3 hours. At least in the version I watched. I think there is a second cut that's a little bit shorter. Maybe that's a bit better. But I watched the sort of original cut of this that was just over 3 hours long, and it just takes forever to actually get into the story itself. We spend so long getting to know the sort of three main characters played by Samuel L. Jackson, Kurt Russell, and Jennifer Jason Leigh. We take a long time to get to know them before the actual story kicks in. And a lot of the time, for the first hour, I just didn't really know where it was going. I didn't know a ton about the movie going into it. I always try and not know a ton about the movie before I go into one. And I didn't really know a lot about this. I didn't know there was going to be a mystery involved or anything like that. Um, so when the mystery actually did start, I was kind of thinking to myself, why didn't this happen 30 minutes ago? Why did we have to spend, so long getting into this? Because when that part kicks off, the last sort of hour and a half or so is pretty great. It just takes a long time to actually get there. Um, I do think that the script itself isn't overly strong. It's definitely not as quotable as a lot of Tarantino's other films are. I don't think it's his strongest dialogue or strongest sort of script in general. That's not saying the characters themselves aren't interesting. They are. They're interesting characters, and the cast, it's a very stacked cast. It's very good. But the script itself is a little bit weak. The film's a little bit too long. I feel like it's a film that almost has like kind of wasted potential. This has the bones of a really great film, but for me, it just doesn't come together. It's definitely not a bad film. It's a good bit better than Death Proof in my opinion. Not a bad movie by any means, because once it gets going, it does get very good and very interesting. But I feel like there's a lot of things in this where it just could have been tightened up a lot more. And maybe the second cut does tighten things up. Maybe I'd enjoy that one a little bit better. But in terms of the original cut that I watched, yeah, good film, but takes a while to get where we need to go, unfortunately. And next up for me, we have the iconic debut from 1992, Reservoir Dogs. For those who haven't seen it, the few sort of film buffs who listen to these podcasts who maybe hasn't seen Reservoir Dogs, essentially it's a heist movie without the heist. We see the before and the after. A group of hired sort of criminals are brought together. They don't know each other's names. All they know is that they have to steal some diamonds, bring it back to a warehouse. But the heist goes wrong. It seems like there might be a rat, and the whole thing kind of unfolds from there, going back and forth. That sort of slowly revealed who the rat is and what the connotations are, kind of in the present for that information. It's a pretty great cast, for a debut film, especially. It's in general, it's a really good debut film. I do feel it lacks the conviction of a lot of the films that we're going to kind of talk about later on. It's you can tell it's a debut movie. He's not fully confident, and Tarantino's probably one of the most confident people in the world. But you can tell he's not fully confident with his craft, which is completely understandable. It's a debut movie. I'm not using that as a detractor. I'm not sort of comparing this at the same level to his later films, where obviously he was more experienced, but it is pretty noticeable. The setup itself is interesting, as I said, but the script isn't as tight as his later scripts either. It feels like some of the time jumps that we do, I feel like it's a little bit self-indulgent in a way that Tarantino is trying to show off the characters that he's created. He wants to like give them sort of moments when that's not actually servicing the plot all that well. Like we see the background of Mr. Blonde played by Michael Madsen, and it doesn't really affect the main outcome. There's a small moment that has a little bit of information that's kind of important later on, but I feel like a lot of the time jumps weren't really all that necessary. If as I said, maybe it's a little bit self-indulgent of him just trying to show off these characters when he should have been more kind of hyper focused on what's good for the plot, what's not good for the plot. Maybe that's a sort of bad knockdown on it. I'm not too sure. That's how I felt when I was watching it recently. I just got to the point where I was like, okay, do we really need to be going back and forth all this much? I'm really interested in what's happening in the present. But overall, it's a good film. It's enjoyable. Has a killer soundtrack, as it most people will know, and a lot of Tarantino films are like that, killer soundtracks. Just not as good as what's going to come up later. So next up, we have what might be potentially the most sort of controversial placement in this list, because this is where I'm putting 1994's Pulp Fiction. It's probably Tarantino's most sort of well-known, sort of most iconic film. It's a film that a lot of people, have seen, maybe sort of his most seen out of all of his filmography, just because of how famous it is, and it put him on the map. It did lots of great stuff for indie cinema. Um, but for me, it's a film that the more I've watched it, the more that initial magic has kind of worn off over time. He flirts with greatness a lot during it, but yeah, for me there was just a lot of little things that I just I just couldn't really get behind, while I was watching it. The main thing for me was, when I first started getting into movies at, at the age of kind of like 16, 17, when a lot of people sort of first get into film, we watch these films like Pulp Fiction because they are super famous, but they're also not like sort of more generic popcorn movies. They're the first kind of, quote unquote real movies that people will watch. And like most people, when I first watched it, I thought that the dialogue was what really stood out for me. How the characters talked to one another. I thought it was incredibly cool, super original. Because I'd never heard, characters in a movie talk like the way that the characters in Pulp Fiction talk. I thought the script was fantastic. But when I watched it again a couple of weeks ago, again, I thought initially I was sort of getting into it. I was like, yeah, this is pretty cool. This is just as cool as I remember. That's nice to know. But as the film went on, I just felt more and more like every line is just a bit hollow and like almost like cold. And I mean that in a way that it's like Tarantino spent so long trying to perfectly calculate every single line to be ironic or referential or have some undercurrent that it actually becomes very shallow. Um, there's no sort of realness to how people talk. Something that a lot of people say with Tarantino movies is that, oh, the gangsters are cool because they talk like real people. But when you watch it and think about that, they actually don't talk like real people at all. Pretty much everything they say is like a reference or a joke or is layered in some kind of irony. And as the film went on, it started to like really grate on me. The dialogue was becoming actually very annoying, and I don't know if that's a personal problem. I would love to know if other people feel this way. But yeah, for me, I just had a tough time with the dialogue as it went on. It became annoying. Um, Now, luckily, the film is super stylish. It's great to look at. It's a really well directed film. He doesn't really hold back too much. he really shows that he's a great director. In this movie, major step up from Reservoir Dogs, which is only a 2 year gap. So pretty impressive. Obviously, he got a lot of confidence from the positive reception of Reservoir Dogs. When he came to making this one, and I feel the script, apart from the dialogue, the actual sort of layout of the plot, even though it is sort of jumpy like Reservoir Dogs, I feel like it's a lot more coherent than Reservoir Dogs. The time jumps don't feel as discombobulating. You feel like there's a cohesiveness to it, despite the fact that we do jump forwards and back. Without any real reference point. When you jump forward and back, you're sort of left to figure it out for yourself. But it's not a mystery. That's the kind of best way I can describe that. My other kind of major detractor though from Pulp Fiction, which is why I've kind of placed it so low, is there's an entire segment that's dedicated to Bruce Willis's character as a boxer who's supposed to throw a fight but actually doesn't, and rips off Marcellus Wallace, the sort of main gangster character. Um, and I just hated that whole segment. It was never my favorite segment as I sort of watched the film, as a teenager. And watching it again, I just really wanted it to be over because it doesn't actually add anything to the overarching narrative. You have the other segments that are all part of this story, with John Travolta's character and, sort of connected to Samuel L. Jackson's character. But then this one is just kind of way out of left field. Yes, John Travolta's character does show up eventually, but I feel like it doesn't actually add anything to the movie. Like, you could take out that entire segment and I think the film only gets better because you have less runtime to sit through. And maybe that's a controversial take. Maybe this is a controversial placement. Well, if I do know for a fact it's probably a controversial placement, but I'd love to know more if more people think the same way about the Bruce Willis segment because um, I've never really talked to anyone extended about Pulp Fiction in this way. So maybe it is just me, but yeah, that's a major detractor. The fact that we spend so long in this segment of a film that I don't think is good and I don't think adds anything of substance, is the reason why it's so far down on the list, alongside the grading dialogue. One of the really interesting things for me when I was going through this director run was seeing how my tastes had changed, especially for films that I hadn't seen since I was like 17 or 18. And there's a couple on here that I do feel that way, and I'm going to talk about one of them right now. And it's kind of funny thinking about it because the reason why I liked this film so much this time around was the same reason I didn't like it when I first watched it. I'm talking about the film that came after Pulp Fiction. It was 1997's Jackie Brown. And it's interesting. The reason why I didn't like Jackie Brown so much when I was younger was that it doesn't really feel like a Tarantino movie. It's not chock full of obvious references and pop culture sort of call outs. It feels very different to all of his other films. And I didn't like that when I was young because I liked Tarantino. I wanted films to, feel like his films. But this time I found Jackie Brown really refreshing because of that. I think there's a few things that kind of help this. Obviously, he's not using a lot of the cast he would use in all of his other movies apart from Samuel L. Jackson. Pretty much everybody else in this movie, as far as I can remember, hadn't worked with Tarantino before and would never work with him again. People like, Robert De Niro or Robert Forster, just off the top of my head. Pam Grier, obviously, as well. I suppose Pam Grier in the film being in the film is almost a reference in itself, considering her iconic character, Foxy Brown. Um, I do also think that the script not being an original work, so this was based on a novel. It's an adapted screenplay, and I think that definitely helps as well with Tarantino sort of sticking to a main plot and then sort of creating, well, I say creating, but maybe mutating existing characters into his own vision, creating dialogue that he likes, but having to stick with a particular script. I think makes it this way, makes it very un-Tarantino from a surface level, but I think the film is really, really good. Like with all that sort of pop culture stuff being kept to a minimum, and to be fair, there is still pop culture stuff in this, but with it being kept to a minimum, I think really helps just this film being just a really great crime film. Has a really cool setup. The story is great. the way that Tarantino sort of lays out the story, especially the final act of the film, where we have different characters doing different things all at the same time, and how that's shown is really, really well done. And like Jackie Brown was a film, like I said, I didn't like as a teenager, so I'm pleasantly surprised I enjoyed it as much as I did. Um, Really, really good film. If people are like me and maybe haven't seen Jackie Brown in a long time, they didn't like it, because of how un-Tarantino it is, I'd really implore you to have another watch with a fresh pair of eyes. I'm very, very glad that I did, because it's a really, really good film. Maybe not a great film. We're going to start talking about some great films pretty soon, but it's a really good, solid crime film. So the next film that I'm going to talk about is 2012's Django Unchained. This will be sort of next up in my ranking, and this was another film that I hadn't seen in 10 years since it came out, basically in 2012. I hadn't seen it since then. I had a pretty positive memory of it. I don't remember like not liking it, but I also didn't really feel compelled to watch it again the last 10 years until I was going through this run. And I came out of it like really, really, really enjoying it. There's so much to like about this film. The cast is all phenomenal. The casting in this movie is great. Jamie Foxx, who I think is just super underrated, just as a person in general, incredibly talented human being. He's fantastic as the title character of Django. I'm very glad that it ended up going to him, and Will Smith ended up declining, because I don't know if the film would have turned out the same way if Will Smith was in the lead. Jamie Foxx absolutely kills it. Christoph Waltz is really, really good, really funny. It's cool seeing him in this role compared to his role in Inglourious Basterds, which obviously we'll talk about a little bit later. But despite actually being in only a very short part, well, I say short, he's in the sort of middle third of the film. He's not actually in the film as much as you would think. But Leo DiCaprio is just insane as just pure evil, but like sadistically evil and kind of weirdly funny. Calvin Candy. Yeah, just the cast and the sort of three main characters, all top notch. Some of the best characters that Tarantino has ever written. The film looks great as well, especially with the set design, production design, the costumes. That sort of blue suit that Django wears is really, really good. The dialogue is fantastic as well. We start getting back into quotable Tarantino. Lots of great lines in this movie. Lots of memeable images in this movie. Um, One that, a line that I use a lot, even still, is that Calvin Candy line where he's like, "You had my attention, but now you have, or you had my curiosity, but now you have my attention." I use that line a lot in my daily life, so that kind of shows how quotable this movie is, how great the script is. I do feel it suffers a little bit, like we talked about with the Hateful Eight, and how we're gonna maybe talk about in the next film on the list as well. I do think it suffers a little bit with the length. I do think there's a little bit too much meat on the bone, but as an overall sort of movie experience, super enjoyable film, despite the content being obviously quite sort of quite sad, and quite hard to watch at times. It's great sort of seeing a character get revenge and sort of go after these sort of terrible human beings that feature throughout the movie. The music score is great also. I really have very little bad to say about Django Unchained, apart from the length in some parts. It does sort of dip up and down from a pacing point of view. Um, Also, Tarantino should never play an Australian ever again. I think we can all be in agreement there. So we're into the top three. So these are like my top three Tarantino movies, basically. And we're going to talk about now his most recent film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I watched it originally when it came out. I saw it in the theaters, and it was a really interesting theater experience, because the film was quite subdued for the most part. And then it just has an absolutely batshit bananas last sort of 20, 30 minutes. And I remember my experience in the theater basically being pretty much quietness like throughout the whole movie. And then for those who've seen the movie and sort of know it well, there's a moment where Brad Pitt's character just like clicks. And it's pretty much from that moment till the very end. the whole theater audience was just going wild. It was a really really cool experience. Um, that kind of stuck with me sort of long after I'd seen it, but I hadn't rewatched it until literally this past week when I've been recording. Um, and I think it's another great movie. It's it's really hard for me to sort of talk bad about these films that I've been seeing, and I'm kind of glad because, like I said at the start, I have been pretty unapologetic in how I've been talking about Tarantino and his movies over the last year or so on the podcast, and even just over the last 10 years in my sort of daily life. Um, so I feel a little bit humbled with how much I've been enjoying his movies for the most part, which is good. Because at the end of the day, I like liking movies. I'm not one of these people who is going to hate watch something or go out of my way to say something bad about a movie. I like watching movies. So I'm glad that I've been liking these more than I thought I would have been. That's always going to be positive. For Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, again, the script I think is really good. It's an interesting concept, like with Django and with Hateful Eight. So it seems to be a trend with his sort of most recent movies. I do think there's a little bit too much fat there that it could have been trimmed down a little bit. But I don't think that's as big of a deal because everything else is so great. The cast is fantastic. Leo's back. Brad Pitt is in here as well. Margot Robbie, is in this in a more sort of subdued role. Um, but ultimately, it's one of those movies that it just made me feel it just made me feel good watching it. I've talked about this before on the podcast where despite how much I enjoy watching movies, as entertainment or for artistic merit, etc., etc., there's not a whole lot of movies that elicit like an emotional response, like sort of have that stirring in my chest. And the end of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood really did that. It's kind of equally chaotic, cathartic, and euphoric. And I was doing some reading, on the film, sort of after I had watched it to see if it was just me, and a few reviewers had mentioned this sort of similar kind of sense of relief in a good way, once the film ends and we get the ending. So it really had a profound effect on me, when I rewatched it again. It really made me sit back and think hard, sort of as the credits were going. Um, from a filmmaking point of view, the direction is fantastic. I said the script is already pretty good. It's not as quotable maybe as his other movies, but I think that when everything else is so solid, you don't really need everything else to be quotable. There's a couple of things, there's a couple of scenes along with the ending that really sort of stayed with me. Most people talk about the scene where Leo's kind of filming that Western. I think it was I can't remember if it was a TV show or a movie. I think it was a TV show he was filming where he was the bad guy of the week. That's just like that sequence in itself is quite long from when he first arrives on set to when he actually leaves. It takes up a good third of the movie. But it's really really good, really interesting. Leo is fantastic. You really get a deep insight into his character, during that segment, and Leo himself gets to show up his acting chops, both playing, his character and playing his character's character. So he's almost playing two characters in this film in quick succession, and he really does that, knocks it out of the park. It's fantastic. And there's another great scene with Brad Pitt's character that's running. I believe it's actually running concurrently, if I remember correctly, where he ends up giving one of the Manson cultists a lift back to the sort of ranch where they're staying, which used to be an old TV movie set. And he recognized the house and wants to go in and talk to his friend because he doesn't believe he's actually there. He thinks that these guys are up to no good. And he shares a scene with Dakota Fanning, who we talked about recently, when we talked about Brimstone. I'd forgot she was in this. I'd said I hadn't seen Dakota Fanning in anything in about 10 years, which obviously I was wrong because she's in this very briefly. And she's really good in this, despite only appearing in one scene. Um, but that scene in general is just incredibly tense. It's almost as tense as the basement scene in Zodiac, which for those who've seen Zodiac will know the exact scene I'm talking about. But I feel like I'm starting to ramble on this film, so I'm gonna kind of stop it there. But yeah, this was a really really enjoyable film. I'm tempted to read the novel. I know that Tarantino did write a novel to go alongside this that expands on the story a little bit. I'm tempted to give that a read. I've just picked up his book, Cinema Speculation, a collection of essays and nonfiction works. Once I finish with that, I think I'm going to pick up the novel to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood because I just enjoy the characters and I enjoy the sort of timeline he's created here. So yeah, this is a film I really enjoyed. It's number three at the moment, but honestly, it's one that I can see sort of growing over time. And there could be maybe in 10 years later, there could be a time when I say that this is my favorite Tarantino movie because I like Django. I have nothing bad to say about it, but it really did have a sort of profound effect on me. So the mathematicians among you may be wondering, Adam, why did you say you were in the top three? There's still three more films to go. But the reason I said that is because I'm counting Kill Bill as one film. Obviously, it was released as two separate parts, Volume 1 and Volume 2, but that wasn't the way that Tarantino intended it. This was supposed to be one long film, and He Who Shall Not Be Named decided that no, we need to cut a load of stuff out, and Tarantino said, okay, well, we'll just release this as two separate films. But I'm going to talk about them as one. Well, I'm going to count them on my list as one, but I will maybe give my opinion on each one separately because Volume 2 was one of those ones like Jackie Brown that um, jumped up my list quite a bit, compared to if I was making this list 10 years ago. So, starting off with Volume 1, when I first, started getting into film, started getting into Tarantino, and I saw Kill Bill Volume 1, blew my socks off. It was just insane to me, what this film was. I rewatched it over and over and over again. For the longest time, my favorite sort of mini, like we'll say, I can't really say scene because it's too long to be a scene, but my favorite sort of segment of a movie is the sort of that fight in the House of Blue Leaves, the bride versus the Crazy 88. That was like my favorite segment of a movie for the longest time, for years and years and years. Um, and I was a little bit worried that maybe it would age poorly. And aside from like little dialogue quirks, which I think are mainly taken from how voice actors would have talked in dubs of like kung fu movies, so I can kind of forgive them. I've nothing bad to say about it. I absolutely love Kill Bill Volume One. Fight scenes are amazing, especially with the crazy 88s, and then the fight with Lucy Liu's character. It's phenomenal filmmaking. I remember, I'm just trying to remember this from many years ago, but on my DVD copy of the Kill Bill movies that I had, there was a conversation with Quentin Tarantino, about the sort of making of the film, and he said on it something along the lines of that he was always terrified to make a straight action movie because action is so difficult to film. And I never really thought about it until he said it, but like with so much movement and cuts and choreography involved, then yeah, absolutely, that makes complete sense. And the bride as a character and Uma's performance in general is absolutely fantastic. She is stoic, but you feel for her emotionally. The journey she's taken. She brings through so many emotions, both in volume one and volume two. You just can't help but root for her character, but also be in awe of everything that she can do. Absolutely fantastic. And I sort of talked about earlier, Tarantino's shtick of doing pop culture references and sort of referencing, films and filmmakers that he sort of liked, growing up. This film's full of them. It's chock full of references, but it never actually feels cluttered. All the references he does, feels organic, like including Hattori Hanzo and, in volume two, including like Pai Mei, these characters that he didn't create, but it never feels like he's doing it just to be smug or arrogant. He feels like that these characters are important to the story. They're almost like they're his characters when they're not, but he treats them with the same kind of delicacy, which is I think it's fantastic. And then when it comes to volume two, this was a film I really just didn't care that much about when I was younger, probably because it's much slower paced than Volume One. doesn't have any big flashy fight scenes like Volume 1 does. It's a much more subdued, sort of character and dialogue driven affair, which, if I'm being honest, was disappointing. Coming off Volume 1 and going to Volume 2 when you're 18 and you just want to watch, crazy action sequences. Going to Volume 2 is a little bit jarring, too jarring for me to really appreciate it. So when I watched it again this time, it really just blew me away now that sort of my tastes have developed and I have become sort of more partial to films that are character and driven and have really strong dialogue and have really cool themes. Volume 2 was fantastic, and again, I don't think it gets its due with sort of general audiences, again probably for the same reasons why I didn't like it that much 10 years ago. But for me, I thought it was phenomenal. Seeing the sort of influences of westerns and sort of neo westerns on it. Um, Having that whole sequence, as I said, with Pai Mei that I mentioned before. When I was 18, I didn't know who Pai Mei was. I just thought this was like a random weird character that Tarantino made up. Obviously, now I understand that, Pai Mei was based on a real life figure and was obviously a recurring sort of antagonist in Shaw Brothers movies. It just makes a lot more sense to me now when I watch it. I'm getting the references, I'm seeing the influences, and it's all beginning to click. And especially once you get to the end of the film, what I once thought was a really lackluster ending, I now find really sort of beautiful and poetic and cathartic. When I came away at the end of Volume 2, I was really moved by everything that I'd seen. I'd watched them back to back pretty much. And as a complete package, seeing the bride's journey from the start of Volume 1 to the end of Volume 2, it's one of the best arcs in sort of modern film storytelling. So Kill Bill as a whole, phenomenal. I've really nothing to say, bad to say about either movie. So just before we talk about the last film on this list, and those who know Tarantino's filmography well are going to know what film it is because you've been maybe marking them off as we've been going along. But just before I talk about it, just wanted to once again give a shout out to our new YouTube channel at They Live by Film. The link is in the episode description. There hasn't been a new video up in a little while, just on the back of myself being sick and then just super busy when I came back to work. But we are going to work on getting more sort of regular content up on there as soon as possible. So if you want to, drop a follow on it, hit the notification bell just so that when we do start putting videos up a bit more regularly, you will catch them. Also, if you want to give me a follow on Twitter, you can follow me at AdamLundy23. I'm going to start getting into Twitter a little bit more. It's probably the social media platform that I had the least experience with, but I'm going to try and get on there a bit more, to engage with you guys. If you want to give me a follow, feel free to do so. I'll be posting episodes when they go live. So if you want to talk about the episode in the, in the comments or whatever, we can do that. That's no problem. I'd love to engage with you guys, the listeners. That would be fantastic. But for now, we'll move on to the final film, which is 2009's Inglourious Bastards. So, at the end of Inglourious Bastards, and this isn't really a spoiler, but at the end of Inglourious Bastards, Brad Pitt's character Aldo Rain looks directly into the camera and says, basically along the lines of this might just be my masterpiece. And I believe that is Quentin Tarantino talking to himself because this is his most complete film. I think it's as close to a perfect film that he is yet to make. Obviously, if he keeps his promise to 10 films, then, he'll only have one more to go. Um, and it will have to be a very, 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 very good movie to beat out Inglourious Bastards. There is nothing wrong that I can say about this film. I only have positive things to say about it. Um, I think it's his best script. From what I'd read about it, he had worked on this script for a long time, and you can tell that it's very polished. The dialogue is fantastic, but also the characters that he creates are all incredible. They're memorable, they are interesting, they have rich backstories, and the way that each sort of main character's story intertwines is just really well done. It's really organic. It's quite genius how he manages to sort of get everything together at the end because when you first start watching it, there's little bits and pieces. We have Christoph Waltz's character, going after a Jewish family. You have one of that family escaping, and then you have the Inglorious Bastards. This Jewish army regiment, who's sort of are basically Nazi hunters, and you're kind of wondering how they're all going to interlink. And when they eventually do, it's perfect. One of the best film endings ever, I think. Um, well, not the direct ending, but the sort of final last set piece scene is incredible and mind blowing. When this came out, if you're in any way a history buff, you'll be quite shocked as to how this film ends because it's just utter insanity. And I love that he had the balls to kind of go that crazy with the ending because a lot of directors making a historical film wouldn't dare to do that. But it goes to show that he's his own person. He had his own idea and he was going to stick to it. And it was really, really well executed. But also the opening scene of this film, which obviously features Christoph Waltz, one of the best opening scenes of all time. In all of cinema history, just the how the scene develops, how it's shot, how the characters slowly begin to show their true colors, the dialogue. It's just top notch. If I could ever write a movie scene half as good as that, then geez, I could die happy. It's amazing. It's crazy to think that the same guy who wrote this, wrote some of the stuff in like the films I talked about earlier, like in Death Proof. It's like night and day. It's like nearly Shakespearean, the level of talent that was exuded from that script. The film looks great as well. Just in general, the direction's top notch. It has references, but are all sort of historically relevant. You know, like there was stuff I didn't catch obviously when I was younger, but I was catching this time. Like for example, when Shoshana has her movie theater that she inherits, and she's hanging up a sign for what's sort of coming up. The film that's being advertised is La Corbeau, which was by Clouseau, and it was shot during Nazi Germany, but it's very thinly veiled attack at those in France who are ratting out people to the Nazi regime. So it's just a really good reference to that time, and to pick that movie in particular, especially with Shoshana's character, being related to it. Very, very interesting, very funny, really good, and a good one for the film buffs to kind of get. It's not as obvious as some of the other pop culture references that he does. Um, but yeah, like I said, like the whole film is just phenomenal. I can't say anything bad about it. It's hard for me to critique a film that I love so much and that I think is so well done. Um, I know that a lot of people didn't care too much about Inglourious Basterds and were maybe put off by the fact that so much of the film is in like languages other than English, um, which was kind of tough for me originally when I first saw it. When I think I was a bit younger than my film sort of buff starting days. I think I was maybe sort of 14 or 15 when I saw it. It was close enough to when it came out, maybe a couple of years after it came out when I first saw it. Um, and I liked it, but I didn't love it. It was only when I started getting into film and I rewatched it, I started to love it, and I love it again now, even though it's been about 10 years since I've seen it. I still love it just as much. I think it's by far his best film. It's his most complete film. It's as close to a perfect film as he has yet to make. But if I keep talking about it, I'm just going to keep going around in circles and saying the same thing. So I'm going to tie off from here. Like I said, give us a follow on the new YouTube channel. If you like this kind of content, feel free to leave comments and stuff like that where you can. Like I said, we are going to do a couple of more episodes before we get back to our sort of regularly scheduled programming where we're going to do that Renoir episode. We promise we're not avoiding Renoir. We will get to it. It'll just be a couple of weeks down the line. But for now, we're going to sign off from here. Take care.